The phone kept ringing like it knew his name. A thin, electric sound slicing through the apartment, through the stale air that smelled of old coffee and damp wool. He stood barefoot on cold linoleum, the receiver vibrating against the table, each ring a small accusation. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed and then faded, as if the city itself had decided not to get involved. Metal pressed against his palm. Keys. Too many keys. They clinked softly when his hand shook, a nervous little choir that betrayed him more than sweat ever could. Sweat was easy. Sweat lied. Keys told the truth. He didn't answer the phone. Not yet. Water dripped from the kitchen sink, slow and deliberate, counting seconds he no longer owned. Drip. 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 The sound crawled into his skull and nested there. He stared at the wall clock. The second hand ticked forward with the confidence of something that had never had to run. Outside, tires hissed on wet asphalt. A car door slammed. Footsteps. Paused. Continued. He smiled without meaning to. It was the kind of smile that had opened doors, softened suspicions, earned second chances that should never have existed. A practiced curve of lips, harmless, polite, almost apologetic. The smile of a man who could ask for help lifting a couch and walk away with your trust instead. The phone rang again. This time he picked it up. Hello. His voice came out steady, friendly, faintly tired. The voice of a man inconvenienced by life, not hunted by it. A pause. Breathing on the other end. Someone listening carefully, like they were memorizing him. Yes, he said, nodding to no one. Yes, I understand. The words stacked up neatly between them. Dates. Times. Questions that pretended to be casual. He answered the way he always did, with cooperation polished to a shine. He even chuckled once, a soft sound, self-deprecating, the laugh of someone who knew how ridiculous misunderstandings could be. When the call ended, the room felt smaller. He set the receiver down gently, as if loud noises might offend it. For a moment, he considered washing his hands. Old habit. Then he laughed, sharp and quick, at the absurdity of pretending cleanliness meant anything anymore. Knuckles knocked at the door. Firm. Professional. No urgency. That was worse. He opened it before they knocked again. Two men stood there, coats damp, faces neutral in that practiced way that said everything had already been decided. One of them glanced past him into the apartment, eyes flicking to the keys, the sink, the clock. The other read his name from a small notebook, pronouncing it carefully, like a word with multiple meanings. Sir, the first one said, we need you to come with us. He nodded, already reaching for his jacket. As they walked down the narrow stairwell, the smell of gasoline drifted up from the street, mixing with rain and rust and something older, something human. His shoes echoed on concrete. Each step sounded louder than the last, as if the building wanted to remember him. Outside, red and blue lights painted the night in ugly colors. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their faces pale, curious, hungry. He caught his reflection in a car window. The smile was gone. In its place, something tighter. Calculating. Alive. Cold metal closed around his wrists. The click was soft. Final. In the distance, another siren began to howl. And in that moment, as the cuffs bit into skin and the crowd leaned closer, one question hovered over the scene, unspoken but unavoidable, like the ringing phone he could still hear in his head. What kind of man gets arrested politely? And why did it take so long? The patrol car smelled like vinyl and damp coats. The back seat was molded plastic, shaped to discourage comfort, like the system itself didn't want sympathy to get any ideas. He sat straight, wrists aching slightly, watching streetlights slide across the window in long, broken streaks. No one spoke. The officer driving cleared his throat once, the sound of a man preparing to say something important and then deciding against it. The other one adjusted the radio. Static whispered secrets no one bothered to decode. He broke the silence first. Is this about the misunderstanding at the lake? He asked, voice calm, curious, almost helpful. The question landed gently, like a test balloon. Neither officer answered. He nodded, as if that made sense. Silence could be useful too. Silence let people project. He had learned that early. The car stopped at a red light. A woman crossed the street with grocery bags, unaware, unafraid. He followed her with his eyes until she disappeared between parked cars. For a brief, inconvenient moment, something like envy flickered in his chest. Then it was gone. At the station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, turning skin gray and honest. The air smelled of paper, sweat, and burned coffee. Someone laughed in another room. Someone else slammed a drawer shut. Life, continuing rudely. They uncuffed him at a desk scarred with old initials and newer frustrations. An officer slid a form across the surface, the paper whispering as it moved. Full name, the officer said. He gave it. Occupation. He paused just long enough to feel thoughtful. Law student. The officer looked up. One eyebrow twitched. A micro-expression. Doubt, curiosity, the faint embarrassment of realizing the person in front of you didn't fit the picture you'd already painted. Law student. Volunteer. Political campaign worker. A man who returned library books on time. A man who smiled at neighbors and remembered their dogs' names. Do monsters do that? He watched the question flicker across their faces without ever being spoken. It amused him. Not in a loud way. In a private, internal way that warmed him better than any apology ever could. They asked about his car. He answered. About his whereabouts. He answered. About people he knew. He answered, occasionally correcting them, gently, like a tutor helping slow students keep up. At one point, an officer leaned back in his chair and sighed. You're being very cooperative, he said, half compliment, half suspicion. Well, he replied, tilting his head, I believe in the system. The words sounded right. Clean. Respectable. The irony sat between them, thick and comfortable. A file landed on the desk with a dull thud. Photographs peeked out from the edges, black and white glimpses of places and things that no longer belonged to the living. The officer didn't slide them over. Not yet. He wanted control of the moment. He noticed the officer's hands instead. Short nails. A faint tremor in the fingers. Fear hid better in professionals, but it always leaked out somewhere. Before we go further, the officer said, is there anything you want to tell us? Anything. Confessions started with that word. So did jokes. So did lies that sounded like truth if you dressed them well enough. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, as if sharing something personal. I think, he said carefully, that people are capable of terrible misunderstandings when they're afraid. No one laughed. Outside, rain began to fall harder, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang. He felt it in his chest, a phantom vibration, a reminder of how easily sound could command attention. The officer closed the file. For now. You think this is fear? The officer asked. He smiled again, small and reasonable. Don't you? And in that moment, sitting under flickering lights with a form half-filled and a future not yet sealed, none of them understood the real question lurking beneath the paperwork. If evil doesn't look like evil, how long do you invite it inside before you realize you're hosting it? He didn't know it yet. But this was only the beginning. Long before police stations and case files, there was a boy staring into a mirror that lied to him. The house was quiet in the way secrets prefer. Curtains drawn. Dust floating lazily in thin beams of afternoon light. He sat on the edge of his bed, shoes neatly aligned, listening to voices downstairs that stopped whenever he moved too loudly. He learned early that silence could be instructional. His mother loved him with a nervous kind of devotion, the kind that overcompensates. Too many questions. Too much protection. She smiled the way people do when they're afraid the truth might break something fragile beyond repair. And maybe she was right. The boy grew up believing his sister was his mother and his grandparents were his parents. A family tree drawn with invisible ink. Everyone played their part well enough, but lies have weight. They press down on a child's chest at night, even when he doesn't yet know why he can't breathe properly. He was well behaved. Polite. Teachers liked him. He said thank you and meant it just enough to be convincing. When other boys scraped their knees and cried, he watched. When they fought, he studied the aftermath. He didn't crave chaos. He catalogued it. At school, he learned how to disappear in plain sight. Average grades at first. Nothing remarkable. Nothing alarming. The safest place to hide is between expectations. But something shifted when the truth slipped out. Not in a dramatic confession. No slammed doors or screaming matches. Just a comment, carelessly delivered, like a plate dropped by accident. You know she's your sister, right? The mirror cracked that day. He didn't confront anyone. That wasn't his style. He absorbed it instead, like poison taken in small doses. The revelation didn't make him angry. It made him curious. If this was a lie, what else was negotiable? Identity, it turned out, was flexible. He began to remake himself. New posture. New cadence in his voice. He read more. Dressed better. Watched how confident men walked, how admired men spoke. He practiced smiles the way musicians practice scales. Charm is not a gift. It is a skill learned by those who need it. In high school, girls noticed him. Not because he was loud or dominant, but because he listened. Or at least, he appeared to. He remembered details. Favorite colors. Small complaints. The kind of information people give away freely when they believe they're safe. He made them feel seen. Behind closed doors, he collected fantasies like trophies, arranging them carefully in his mind. Control fascinated him. Not violence. Not yet. Control. The idea that another person's emotions could be guided, redirected, switched off. He never told anyone about the urges. That would have been impolite. Instead, he joined debates. Politics. Clubs. Places where intelligence could masquerade as morality. Where ambition sounded like virtue. Where people applauded confidence without asking where it came from. By the time he left home, he had perfected the role. The polite boy. The promising student. The young man with a future. No one noticed that his reflection no longer quite matched his face. And no one asked what happens when a child grows up knowing that truth is optional, identity is malleable, and love can survive almost any lie. He would answer that question later. But first, he needed an audience. College smelled like paper, ambition, and cheap cologne. He arrived with a suitcase that carried more intention than clothing. New city. New face. Same mirror. Universities were perfect places to reinvent yourself. Everyone was pretending to be smarter, braver, more certain than they really were. He fit right in. He studied psychology first. Not out of curiosity. Out of utility. Minds were systems. Systems could be mapped. Weak points identified. Professors talked about behavior like it was weather, patterns, influences, probabilities. He listened with the patience of a man learning how locks worked. He wasn't brilliant. That was the secret. He was diligent. He watched what earned praise and replicated it. He spoke in seminars just enough to sound engaged. He quoted textbooks without sounding like he memorized them. Intelligence, he learned, was often just confidence delivered at the right volume. He dressed the part. Clean shirts. Conservative ties. Shoes polished even when no one would notice. Especially when no one would notice. Details were the difference between being trusted and being invisible. Women trusted him. Not all at once. Not recklessly. Trust arrived in pieces. A shared walk after class. A complaint about a boyfriend. A laugh that lingered too long. He offered sympathy like a service. Free consultations. No judgment. He had learned long ago that people confuse understanding with kindness. He volunteered on political campaigns, knocked on doors, shook hands, smiled until his cheeks ached. He spoke about law and order, about justice, about building a better future. He believed in none of it, but belief was optional. Performance was not. Older men liked him, saw themselves in him, or the sons they wished they had been. They gave advice, connections, letters of recommendation written in ink that assumed decency. He absorbed it all. At night, in small rented rooms that smelled faintly of detergent and loneliness, the fantasies sharpened. They grew more specific, less abstract. He began to notice women on the street not as people, but as possibilities. Variables. Height. Hair. The way confidence collapsed when uncertainty was introduced. Still, nothing happened. That restraint fed his sense of superiority. He wasn't like the others. He was in control. He told himself this often, like a mantra whispered before sleep. Law school came next. Another mask, heavier and more prestigious. The language of statutes and cases appealed to him. Law was a game where truth lost regularly but still pretended to be important. Procedure mattered more than morality. He respected that honesty. But cracks began to show. Missed classes. Slipping grades. He blamed stress. Finances. The system. Everyone accepted these excuses because they sounded reasonable. Reasonable men are rarely questioned. Friends noticed mood swings. Periods of intense charm followed by sudden withdrawal. He would disappear for days, then return refreshed, focused, almost euphoric. No one asked where he had been. Privacy was a courtesy extended to those who seemed stable. Then there was the first time he tested himself. Not a crime. Not yet. A rehearsal. He feigned injury. A sling. A cast. Helplessness carefully constructed. He asked for assistance from strangers. Watched how quickly empathy overrode caution. Watched how bodies leaned closer when they thought they were safe. It thrilled him. Not in the way movies would later suggest. There was no frenzy. No loss of control. Just a calm, steady satisfaction. Like solving a difficult puzzle and realizing the solution was disturbingly simple. He went home that night and slept better than he had in years. Somewhere inside him, a line had been crossed so quietly it barely registered. No alarms. No guilt. Just a subtle shift in gravity. Education had given him language. Ambition had given him cover. And the world, generous as ever, had given him permission through neglect. He didn't know it yet. But the mask had learned how to walk. And soon, it would learn how to hunt. The first step was the hardest. Not because it was violent, but because it was deliberate. It happened on an ordinary day, the kind people forget immediately. Gray sky. Damp pavement. Wind that carried the smell of wet leaves and car exhaust. He stood beside his car, adjusting the sling on his arm, testing its weight like an actor checking a prop before opening night. He looked harmless. That was the achievement. He asked for help the way decent people do, politely, with embarrassment, as if the request itself caused him pain. Could you help me carry this? Just to the car. I'm sorry to bother you. His voice carried a soft urgency, the sound of a man who didn't want to be weak but had no choice. She hesitated. Hesitation is the last defense. It doesn't last long. The world teaches kindness early and suspicion late. He relied on that curriculum. What followed would later be dissected in reports and headlines, flattened into phrases like alleged and believed to have occurred. Language would sand down the edges until it almost sounded survivable. But in that moment, there was no language at all. Only breath, weight, confusion. The sudden realization that the rules had changed without notice. Afterward, he sat alone in the car, hands steady on the steering wheel, listening to his own breathing. His heart wasn't racing. That surprised him. He had expected chaos, panic, remorse. Instead, there was clarity. The mask hadn't slipped. It had evolved. He didn't celebrate. That would have been crude. He drove home carefully, obeying traffic laws, stopping fully at red lights. Civilization mattered. Appearances mattered. He showered longer than usual, not to cleanse, but to think. Water hit his shoulders in hot, rhythmic pulses, like punctuation marks. This is real now, he thought. Not as a warning. As an observation. Days passed. Life continued. Classes. Conversations. Smiles exchanged in hallways. No lightning bolt struck him down. No one knocked on his door. The absence of consequences felt like approval. So he did it again. And again. Each time, the preparation became smoother. The excuses more refined. The selection more precise. He adjusted details the way a craftsman improves technique, timing, location, approach. What had begun as an experiment became a system. Newspapers started using cautious language. Missing. Disappeared. Last seen. The articles were small, tucked between weather reports and grocery ads. He read them over breakfast, buttering toast, noting inaccuracies with mild irritation. That wasn't quite right. They missed this part. They don't understand. Police sketches appeared. Generic faces that looked like everyone and no one. Friends expressed concern in public, then forgot in private. Fear flickered briefly and then retreated. People needed the world to remain predictable. He became careful in public and reckless in thought. A dangerous combination. He listened to conversations about safety with professional interest. Offered advice. Suggested precautions. Played the role of the concerned citizen with unsettling sincerity. Black humor crept in, uninvited but welcome. When someone joked about the crazy guy out there, he laughed along, shaking his head. People watch too many movies, he said once. The irony tasted sharp and satisfying. But control has a cost. The fantasies no longer waited patiently. They demanded expression. What once thrilled him now required escalation. Familiarity dulled the edge. He found himself irritated by small disruptions, by resistance, by anything that challenged the narrative he had written for himself. And still, no one stopped him. What finally changed wasn't conscience or fear. It was attention. A name mentioned twice. A description repeated. A car noticed once too often. Tiny fractures in the illusion. He didn't panic. Panic was for amateurs. He adjusted. Changed locations. Refined stories. Trusting his intelligence to outpace suspicion, because it always had before. He didn't know that systems adapt too. That patterns emerge whether you believe in them or not. That every mask, no matter how well made, leaves fingerprints. The day the mask learned to walk, it also learned something else. Movement creates tracks. And somewhere behind him, faint but persistent, someone had begun to follow them. The disappearances did not arrive like a storm. They came like fog. Slow. Quiet. Easy to ignore until you were already lost in it. A name here. Another there. A girl who missed a shift. A student who never came back from a walk. Faces printed in newspapers with the same hopeful phrasing beneath them. Beloved daughter. Bright future. Last seen wearing. The descriptions blurred together. The city skimmed them like headlines skim guilt. People shook their heads, sighed, and turned the page. Tragedy, when spread thin enough, becomes background noise. He noticed everything. He noticed how long it took before patterns made people uncomfortable. How many coincidences society was willing to tolerate before demanding answers. He noticed which details reporters emphasized and which they avoided. He learned the rhythm of public attention. Brief concern, moral outrage, fatigue, distraction. Fear, he discovered, has a short attention span. He adjusted accordingly. Different neighborhoods. Different routines. Different stories. Sometimes he limped. Sometimes he wore a cast. Sometimes he simply smiled and asked for directions, letting politeness do the heavy lifting. He learned that people trust familiarity more than logic. A friendly face beat statistics every time. At police stations, the mood shifted. Detectives pinned photographs to corkboards, red string forming nervous constellations. They argued over jurisdictions, over whether cases were connected, over whether they were chasing a phantom or embarrassing themselves by forcing a pattern where none existed. One detective smelled of cigarettes and old regret. Another chewed gum aggressively, snapping it like punctuation. They leaned over maps late at night, eyes bloodshot, coffee gone cold, pretending exhaustion was the only reason they couldn't see clearly. Witnesses were unreliable. Memories bent under pressure. One woman described a man who looked kind. Another remembered a limp. A third recalled nothing except the feeling that something was off, too late to be useful. Composite sketches emerged. Generic. Safe. A man who could be anyone. He studied them with interest, amused by how close and how useless they were. That could be me, he thought. That could be everyone. Friends talked about the disappearances in low voices, as if volume itself might summon danger. He listened carefully, nodding at the right moments. He offered concern. He offered rides home. He offered reassurance that sounded like wisdom. Statistically, he said once, stirring his drink, people are safer than they think. No one challenged him. Why would they? He looked like safety. Newspapers escalated their tone. Headlines grew bolder. Rumors leaked. A predator, maybe. A serial offender. The words hung heavy, radioactive. Mothers warned daughters. Campuses held meetings. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards like quiet screams. And still, he moved. What unsettled him wasn't the danger. It was the doubt creeping into conversations. Not about what was happening, but about who deserved belief. Some girls were called reckless. Some were questioned more harshly than the circumstances justified. The world searched for reasons that didn't require confronting its own blindness. He found that funny in a dry, almost academic way. Blame, he knew, was a resource. Limited. People rationed it carefully. Police interviews brushed past him once. Just routine, they said. He answered politely, offering information that sounded helpful without being useful. He corrected a date. Clarified a location. Earned nods of appreciation. Afterward, an officer thanked him for his time. He thanked them back. At night, alone, the pressure mounted. Control became harder to maintain. The ease he once enjoyed was replaced by vigilance. He checked mirrors. He listened for footsteps. He rehearsed alibis like prayers. And yet, part of him enjoyed the tightening net. It proved he mattered. The city was changing because of him. Behavior adjusted. Routes altered. Fear whispered his name without knowing it. There was power in that, a grim kind of authorship. But power attracts attention. And attention attracts questions. Somewhere in a police office, someone circled his name twice. Not in red ink. In pencil. Tentative. Almost apologetic. He didn't know it yet. But the fog was thinning. And shapes were beginning to emerge. He offered his help before anyone asked for it. That was the joke. The kind that takes a second too long to land. Community meetings were held in overheated rooms that smelled of folding chairs and fear. People spoke in fragments. Parents clutched coffee cups like talismans. Police officers stood at the front, rehearsing reassurance they didn't fully believe in. He sat near the aisle. Visible, but not eager. When the discussion turned to prevention, he raised a hand. Not abruptly. Politely. The way good students do. Eve'd been reading about this, he said, voice steady, reasonable. Patterns like these often escalate when there's panic. The offender feeds on chaos. Heads turned. Pens paused. He continued, warming to the room. He spoke about routines, about awareness, about not walking alone at night. Sensible things. The kind of advice that sounds responsible no matter who says it. The room relaxed around him, grateful for clarity, for someone who didn't sound afraid. A police officer nodded. That's a good point. He smiled. Small. Controlled. Later, he stayed behind to talk. Asked questions that sounded curious but weren't. How do you determine connections between cases? What details matter most early on? At what point do you usually narrow suspects? They answered more than they should have. Not because they were careless, but because he looked like one of them. Educated. Calm. Concerned. He spoke their language and respected their authority. That kind of respect opens mouths. In private conversations, he became a sounding board. People speculated freely around him, as if he were a wall. He absorbed theories, fears, half-formed conclusions. He corrected misinformation gently, guiding discussions away from inconvenient details. He even joked once. If you catch him, he said lightly, I hope he turns out to be someone boring. No one wants to live next to a legend. Laughter rippled through the group. Nervous, relieved. Black humor thrives in crisis. It makes people feel brave. He volunteered for a hotline briefly. Listened to worried voices on the other end of the line. Offered reassurance. Suggested precautions. Took notes. The irony didn't escape him. He savored it quietly, like a private toast. At home, he scribbled observations in a notebook. Not names. Not dates. Just impressions. What frightened people? What reassured them? How long panic lasted before it became inconvenience? He was studying the audience reaction to his own work. The arrogance crept in unnoticed. He began to believe not only that he could evade the system, but that he understood it better than those tasked with enforcing it. That he was indispensable to the conversation. A consultant without a badge. Then came the mistake. A casual remark. Too specific. A detail he shouldn't have known. He corrected himself immediately, laughing it off, blaming rumor. Most people accepted it. People prefer easy explanations. They want normality back more than they want truth. But not everyone. One detective stopped chewing his gum. Another didn't write anything down when he usually did. A pause lingered half a second too long. He felt it. The room didn't change, but the air did. Like pressure before a storm. He went home that night restless, irritated by small sounds. The refrigerator hum. The neighbor's television. His own breathing. He told himself it was nothing. Overthinking was a sign of intelligence, not guilt. Still, he reviewed his recent interactions carefully. Replayed conversations. Adjusted future responses. He could recalibrate. He always could. What he didn't account for was the quiet power of accumulation. One comment alone meant nothing. One coincidence was noise. But patterns don't need permission to form. Somewhere, a file grew thicker. A car description circled back. A name reappeared with annoying consistency. The pencil marks became darker. He was helping them, yes. But every time he spoke, every time he volunteered insight, he left a little more of himself on the table. Not enough to notice at once. Enough to matter later. There is a particular irony reserved for men who believe they are invisible. They often become the clearest thing in the room. He still didn't know it yet. But the system had started to listen to him very, very carefully. And systems, once curious, rarely stop. The car was ordinary. That was its first mistake. A dull color. Nothing flashy. The kind of vehicle that disappeared into parking lots full of identical shapes and tired paint jobs. It looked like responsibility. Like errands. Like a man on his way somewhere unremarkable. Which, of course, it was not. It sat in the driveway like a loyal animal, patient, familiar, quietly complicit. He kept it clean. Not obsessively. Just enough. A coffee cup in the holder. Maps folded in the glove compartment. The illusion of normal movement through the world. But cars remember. They collect fibers the way memories collect guilt. Hairs. Scratches. Scents that no air freshener fully erases. They absorb fragments of moments people assume are temporary. Police noticed it because someone noticed it twice. Once is coincidence. Twice is curiosity. 3 times becomes paperwork. A woman mentioned a similar car near a campus. Another remembered the same model idling too long by a sidewalk. Someone recalled a man asking for help, his arm in a cast, his smile apologetic. The descriptions overlapped just enough to irritate a tired detective. They ran the plates. His name appeared without drama. No sirens. No bold typeface. Just a line on a page, underlined lightly. The kind of underlining that pretends not to accuse. An officer knocked on his door one afternoon. Routine questions, they said. He invited them in. Offered coffee. Apologized for the mess, which was minimal and therefore convincing. They asked about his car. Of course, he said, standing smoothly. It's outside. He watched their eyes as they walked around it. The way professionals try not to look like they're looking. He answered questions with ease, even joking once about how unreliable memory could be. I barely remember where I parked yesterday, he said, smiling. They smiled back. But they took notes. Later, when they searched the vehicle, it wasn't dramatic. No sudden gasps. No music swelling. Just methodical movements. Gloves snapping. Flashlights cutting through shadow. Evidence bags whispering open. They found things that didn't belong together. Objects with no innocent explanation when arranged correctly. Traces that suggested proximity when proximity was the last thing anyone wanted to imagine. The car began to tell its story in a language only labs could fully translate. He sat in an interview room while this happened, posture relaxed, hands folded. He believed in distance. Emotional distance. Psychological distance. The idea that events, once completed, existed somewhere else. But distance collapses under scrutiny. A detective returned, expression unreadable. Placed a photograph face down on the table. Didn't slide it forward. Didn't need to. You want to explain this? The detective asked. He leaned back slightly. Not defensive. Thoughtful. Explain what? The photograph turned over. For the first time in a long while, he felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. The awareness that a private world had been breached by strangers with clipboards and patience. Still, he didn't break. He questioned procedures. Challenged assumptions. Spoke the language of law fluently enough to slow the conversation. He knew his rights. He reminded them of that politely. They let him go. For now. That night, he drove with the radio off, listening to the engine hum. The familiar streets felt altered, as if they were watching him back. Every red light lingered too long. Every passing car seemed curious. He considered abandoning the vehicle. But sentimentality intervened. The car had served him well. It felt almost disloyal to discard it over what could still be framed as misunderstanding. That sentiment would cost him. Within days, the tone changed. Interviews became interrogations. Questions sharpened. Politeness thinned. The net, once theoretical, now had weight. And he felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Not guilt. Impatience. The car had known too much. And worse, it had spoken to people who were trained to listen slowly, relentlessly, without the need for spectacle. He still believed he was smarter than the system. But intelligence is not immunity. And machines, unlike people, do not lie out of loyalty. They only wait. And the car was done waiting. The courtroom smelled like polished wood and stale air, a place where time slowed down and pretended to be fair. He entered in a clean suit, hair neatly parted, posture upright. The cuffs were gone now, replaced by something more subtle and far more dangerous. Attention. Cameras clicked. Pens scratched. Faces leaned forward, eager to consume a story they didn't yet understand. He smiled at the jury. Not broadly. Not arrogantly. Just enough to suggest trust. The kind of smile that says, I am reasonable, and reasonable men do not belong here. The prosecution spoke first, laying out facts like bricks. Dates spelled out in careful language. Locations described with restraint. They avoided emotion, knowing emotion could slip and break its neck on cross-examination. They spoke of patterns, of evidence, of a car that had become inconveniently talkative. He listened with interest. When it was his turn, he stood without hesitation. He had decided to represent himself. Against advice. Against expectation. Against what any sane person would do. The courtroom murmured. The judge frowned. Lawyers shifted uncomfortably, sensing both spectacle and disaster. He loved it. There is nothing quite like telling your own story in public and watching people lean in. He spoke confidently, citing cases, questioning witnesses with a sharpness that bordered on theatrical. He objected often, sometimes correctly, sometimes strategically. The judge reprimanded him once. He apologized smoothly. Your Honor, he said, I only want clarity. The jury watched him closely. Some admired the courage. Others felt uneasy without knowing why. He paced just enough to suggest energy, not enough to appear agitated. He wore his education like armor. At one point, he questioned a witness who described a man with a limp. Are you certain it was a limp? He asked gently. Or could it have been an injury? A temporary inconvenience? The witness hesitated. Doubt entered the room like smoke. He made jokes under his breath, quiet enough to feel intimate. A raised eyebrow here. A soft sigh there. Black humor slipped through the cracks, disguised as frustration with bureaucracy. Memory is a fragile thing, he said once, glancing at the jury. We all know that. They did. Days passed. Testimony stacked up. Experts spoke in careful monotones. Evidence appeared, disappeared, reappeared in new contexts. He thrived in the chaos. This was his habitat. Language. Rules. Performance. The trial became less about what had happened and more about him. Who was this man who spoke so well? Who dared challenge the system so openly? Who looked so normal? Reporters scribbled furiously. Headlines followed him home. His name escaped the courtroom and entered living rooms, bars, late-night conversations. He became a topic. A character. A question mark dressed in a suit. But trials are not won on charm alone. While he performed, the prosecution waited. They let him talk. Let him expose his strategies. Let him reveal how much he enjoyed the stage. They understood something he did not. Arrogance accelerates its own downfall. A witness took the stand late in the proceedings. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just precise. Calm. Unshakable. The kind of person juries trust without realizing why. The room shifted. He felt it like a draft against the back of his neck. Adjusted his tie. Smiled again, but this time it didn't land the same way. Something in the audience had changed. Admiration was thinning, replaced by calculation. When the verdict came, it arrived without ceremony. Guilty. The word dropped heavily, dull and final. Not shouted. Not whispered. Just stated. A fact, now unavoidable. He nodded once. Not in acceptance. In acknowledgement. As he was led away, cameras flashed. Someone in the gallery cried. Someone else exhaled in relief. Outside, the world waited to be told what to think. He glanced back once, searching the room for the feeling he had lost. Control. The performance was over. And for the first time, the applause did not come. Freedom arrived as absurdity. The first escape was almost comedic. He slipped through a window left unlocked, timing precise, shoes silent, movements rehearsed. The guards had been distracted by paperwork, fatigue, and the illusion that walls could contain cunning. He walked through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and fear, a grin tugging at his lips. Not triumph. Observation. This was an experiment. How long could the system tolerate cleverness before it noticed? He disappeared into the night. The city outside felt surreal. Streetlights glared like stage lamps. Puddles reflected fractured neon. Footsteps echoed, his and distant, merging. A taxi driver gave him a brief glance, politeness expected, suspicion absent. It was exhilarating. He moved with the confidence of someone invisible, but every detail mattered. He changed jackets in public restrooms. Purchased new shoes. Flew under the radar while authorities scrambled to adjust to the absurdity. The second escape was more daring. He cut through an unlocked door, slipped past a sleeping guard, and exited via a drainage pipe that should have been a trap. It smelled of rust and rot. Water dripped rhythmically, counting the moments he wasn't caught. The sensation of calculated risk thrilled him, not in mania, but in sharp, satisfying clarity. He left small traces intentionally. Nothing direct. Just enough to remind observers that he existed. A shoe print in damp concrete. A forgotten cigarette butt. A coat hung carelessly. Little clues that teased the system, whispered, "I am still here." The authorities were embarrassed. Headlines gleeful in accusation, infuriated in reality. Some laughed at the absurdity. Others fumed, professional pride wounded by the sheer audacity. Meanwhile, he stayed one step ahead. Hotels without reservation. Cash withdrawn from multiple accounts. A borrowed car, ordinary, indistinguishable. He smiled at clerks, nodded at doormen, polite, harmless, untraceable. In private, though, the exhilaration had limits. The weight of constant vigilance pressed against him. Each shadow was a possibility. Each stranger, a variable. Sleep came in fragmented intervals, dreams populated by uniforms and handcuffs. Black humor persisted. He often imagined the system chasing itself, spiraling around corners while he sipped coffee, unobserved, pretending to read a newspaper. But irony has a habit of returning inescapable attention. Eventually, mistakes crept in. Routes repeated. Patterns emerged. Observers pieced together fragments. A careless clerk, a slightly remembered face, a car remembered too clearly. The escapes had been brilliant, audacious, almost comical. But brilliance attracts notice. And notice, unlike him, never forgets. He didn't know it yet, but every movement, every tiny act of freedom, had written a script that the world was beginning to read. And soon, the play would end, not with applause, but with the finality of consequence. The Florida sun was merciless, a low, golden hammer beating down on streets that smelled of salt, exhaust, and fried food. Heat pressed into every pore, sticky and unavoidable, reminding him that no one escapes the weather, not even the cleverest man. He arrived in a new city under a new name. Clean-cut appearance, rented car, rented apartment, polite, professional, and utterly forgettable. Yet the tension never left him. Every passerby could be watching. Every honk could signal suspicion. Even the gulls circling above seemed aware, judging. He moved carefully, blending. Bars. Beaches. Libraries. He observed, calculated, smiled, whispered politeness. Women spoke to him, trusted him. That skill, the same charm perfected over decades, never failed. But each interaction now carried a sharper edge. He measured everything. Every glance, every hesitation, every laugh. The heat made patience brittle. Mistakes came faster. He misremembered a time, chose the wrong street, left fingerprints he didn't notice. The law was closing in, not loudly, not dramatically, but slowly, inexorably. Florida became a stage for final acts. He was caught stealing small things, a grocery store theft, a forged check, and each minor error became a knot in the growing net. Authorities traced patterns he believed invisible. Neighborhoods, routines, acquaintances, all were pieces on a chessboard he no longer fully controlled. He realized, finally, that freedom was a fragile illusion. Every escape, every clever maneuver, had been a rehearsal. The system adapts. Attention accumulates. Patterns form. Even his famous charm, the polite smile, the courteous words, began to draw suspicion. People remembered. Connections were made. And when law enforcement arrived, they were prepared, patient, and methodical. Not impulsive. Not emotional. They waited for him to slip, which he eventually did, not with a grand mistake, but with an accumulation of small, inevitable errors. The capture was quiet. No dramatic chase, no crowd cheering. Just officers calmly stating, "You're under arrest." The cuffs clicked. The sun burned above. Sweat mixed with despair. In the heat, he felt the irony clearly. All the careful planning, all the escapes, all the rehearsed smiles, it had led here. Not humiliation. Not a spectacle. Just inevitability. For the first time in decades, he felt powerless. And yet, he smiled. Small, polite, unconvincing. A man can rehearse a role endlessly, but the script always ends. Even the most clever masks cannot rewrite consequence. Somewhere, hidden beneath the relentless Florida heat, the world continued, oblivious, and he understood the simplest truth. The cost of freedom is higher than the thrill of evasion. And the world always comes for its debts. The execution chamber was stark. Bright lights gleamed off polished metal, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick, sterile, smelling faintly of antiseptic and inevitability. It pressed against him, weightless yet suffocating, as if the walls themselves whispered. It ends here. He walked calmly, hands folded. The guard's eyes followed every move, calculating, professional, unyielding. The straps of the chair were cold against his skin when he sat. The leather pressed into him like a final embrace. He looked around, noting every detail. The witnesses' faces, taut with anticipation. The journalists, pens ready, cameras poised. Some spectators averted their eyes. Others leaned forward. Everyone sought closure, spectacle, morality. The world wanted a story with neat endings. But endings are rarely neat. He felt the restraint of the straps, the cold steel of the ankle cuffs. Yet he was strangely composed. Not pride. Not bravado. Observation. The same detachment that had allowed him to charm, deceive, escape, and manipulate. It was now a shield against chaos he could no longer control. The warden spoke the procedures. Words fell flat, rehearsed. He listened with the patience of a man who had rehearsed far more intricate scripts in his mind. Outside, the crowd murmured. Media vans idled. The city seemed to hold its breath. Some whispered prayers. Some whispered curses. Some whispered his name. All were curious, desperate to witness consequence, to see justice executed in full. No one understood that justice had already happened decades ago, quietly, invisibly, in the lives touched, changed, or destroyed. This moment was only punctuation. He thought briefly of the lives lost. The trust misplaced. The kindness exploited. The smiles he had worn like armor. And for a flicker, he imagined regret. Then it passed. Observation was easier than emotion now. The straps tightened. The room smelled sharper now, fear, sweat, anticipation. A final conversation passed between officials. Checks and confirmations. Legalities performed with solemn care. And then the chair activated. Silence fell deeper than any courtroom. The world seemed to tilt inward. Time compressed. The last breath was not a spectacle, not a lesson, not a moral. It was simply an end. Outside, cameras captured only fragments. People reported facts, not philosophy. Headlines would scream, morals would be debated, Yet the subtle truth, that actions ripple, consequences accumulate, and masks eventually fall, remained unspoken. He looked once more at the ceiling. His eyes saw nothing, absorbed everything. The same calm that had carried him through escapes, trials, and manipulations now met the ultimate inevitability. A lever clicked. The chair did its work. And outside, the world carried on. Neighbors walked dogs. Vendors sold newspapers. Children laughed. The news cycle spun forward. Curiosity flickered, then waned. Sometimes, the audience forgets the story long before the story forgets them. And in that sterile, bright room, one final truth remained. The cost of freedom, charm, and deception is always paid, though the price is rarely witnessed by those who deserve to see it. He was gone. And yet, the echoes lingered. The city exhaled, oblivious. Life went on in its usual disjointed rhythm: traffic, laughter, arguments, errands. The headlines faded, replaced by newer tragedies, newer distractions. People who once whispered his name had forgotten it or pretended to. But the consequences remained. Invisible, stubborn, unmovable. Families who lost daughters, friends who lost companions, communities that learned to lock doors and mistrust strangers, they carried memories sharper than any newspaper clipping. Each life altered left a ripple, a distortion that could never be smoothed. He was gone. But the lessons, or horrors, he left behind persisted. The charm, the intelligence, the smiles that once disarmed suspicion, vanished. What remained was not fear. Not mythology. It was reflection. The mirror of his life now reflected only truth. Not the playful, polite men who had danced through corridors, manipulated trust, and evaded consequences. No, the mirror reflected the cost of choices made without empathy, the quiet devastation of lives intersected and ended by a single, calculating mind. People debated morality endlessly. Was he evil, born or made? Could he have been stopped earlier? Could society have prevented him? The arguments were academic. They missed the point. Evil does not always arrive loudly. It sometimes whispers politely, smiles harmlessly, and slips past us because we are polite too. Sometimes, the most ordinary gestures carry the heaviest weight. A smile. A nod. A favor. Trust extended. And when those gestures are abused, the cost is not just for the victim. It spreads silently, changing the way everyone sees the world. There were no heroes left to save the day. No morality to restore balance. Only the ledger of deeds, closed and heavy. Sometimes, truth is inconvenient. Sometimes, justice arrives only after the story is told, after the chairs are empty, after the headlines fade. Sometimes, the only thing that lingers is the question we fail to answer until it's too late. Could we have seen it coming? Could we have acted sooner? And sometimes, truth disappears along with those who knew it. The smile was gone. The man was gone. Only the echoes remained. Quiet. Unforgiving. And inevitable.